In the name of the God of all mercy, amen. Please be seated. Good and evil may be among the most complicated concepts that humanity endeavors to understand. It's elusive because it seems so simple. There is good in the world, there is evil in the world, and we usually think those are pretty clearly differentiated. Popular culture would often have you believe it's clear. Most movies and TV shows and fictional books have a clear good guy and a clear bad guy. Earlier in this pandemic, one of the ways that Michael and I passed our time in quarantine, particularly in the earlier days when we held that quarantine very strictly and didn't leave the house for about 3 months. So one of the ways that we passed the time was that we endeavored to watch all of the Marvel superhero movies. We have a friend who is an aficionado of such things, and he guided us in the ideal order in which to see all the films. There are currently 24 films in the series, so it is no small undertaking. To date, we've gotten through most of them. I think we only have 2 or 3 left in the series. And while there were some that we both liked and some that we didn't like all that much, and some that Michael liked and I didn't like, and vice versa, one of the common themes throughout all of these films was the idea of good versus evil. And though we often did see less than flattering sides of some of the protagonists, there tended to be stark lines drawn between those who were good, even if they weren't perfect, and those who were evil, even if that was rooted in some past pain. But life outside of fiction almost never works that way. Good and evil are much more often in flux between one another, blended into one another. Reminds me of a line from my favorite TV show, The West Wing. President Bartlett is reflecting on his job and the nature of being president, and he says, every once in a while, there's a day with an absolute right and an absolute wrong. But those days almost always include body counts. Other than that, there aren't very many unnuanced moments, he said. And that's kind of how it is for us. There really aren't that many unnuanced moments in our lives. So with that reality in mind, we encounter these lessons from the sacred text today. First, we meet Joseph of the Hebrew Scriptures and his brothers. You may remember Joseph is the one who was sold into slavery by those same brothers and carried off into Egypt from the promised land. In time, he beats all the odds and rises up to leadership and prominence in the Egyptian empire. By this point in the story that we read this morning, his brothers and his father had followed him into Egypt to feast on his kindness in the midst of a famine. Of his goodness, Joseph helps them out. But now their father has died, and the brothers fear that Joseph's kindness will end. In an act of maturity that most of us could only aspire to, Joseph once again looks on his brothers with compassion. He looks at the experience with a long eye, seeing not just his brother's corruption, but also the good that God brought out of their evil intentions. He sees that there are nuances to his reality. So he errs on the side of kindness and forgiveness. Several centuries later, we have Jesus teaching and interpreting those very same kinds of scriptures. And in the context of this inheritance, the disciples ask Jesus, just how many times should we forgive? And the answer is as many times as it takes. As many times as it takes, not to change your offender, but to change yourself. Because that's what forgiveness really is. It's finding a way to see the world differently than you initially thought you could see it. It's finding the nuance in your experience. Finding that your world will be better and more tolerable if you begin to see it with grace and mercy instead of anger and resentment. When we forgive, it changes us. No one else, just us. Of course, that doesn't mean we're called to be doormats. When relationships in our lives are toxic to our spiritual and emotional health, it sometimes is better to walk apart. But hanging on to that anger and resentment of our experience will only ever hold us back. Learning to live into forgiveness will free us. And that's why it's something we have to keep doing as many times as it takes. Because forgiveness isn't just a one-off. It's the sum of forgiving again and again until we find that freedom that's been promised. It's about learning to live into forgiveness. Not simply saying, I forgive them through clenched teeth and smoldering rage. It takes time and practice and persistence. It's a discipline, like all of our Christian callings. Following Christ and living in community and taking these stories into our hearts and our lives is just one part of the journey. Amen.